Here we have the top level dashboard view of GreenRain. You can see that we've already imported 3 applications. And when you add everything together about those 3 applications, it adds up to 1 million lines of code that GreenRain has analysed across 8,000 files. And frameworks are things like ODBC, Active Record. These are things that applications, like frameworks that applications use to get something done, like Rails for web applications and things like that. This is helpful to tell me if you're going to be doing something with these applications, if you're going to be refactoring them, these are the kind of technologies that you're going to need to know about. It also tells me that 1 million lines of code, for a human to go through that, for example, going through GitHub, clicking through files, maybe downloading files and grepping through for certain kinds of patterns, that's just not possible with 1 million lines of code. That's why you need a tool like GreenRain that doesn't need to be told what these languages are. It will detect the languages in each of the applications and work out using its deep learning engine how that program is constructed and where the technical dependencies are. And you can see in our dashboard, we've just got 3 examples, one of which includes the GreenRain engine itself. So the next thing we're going to look at is how did we import those applications into GreenRain. So we've got a new application we want to import into GreenRain. Very straightforward process. Here we've selected a GitHub repo. It's an ERP open source alternative to SAP. And what we've done is we've downloaded the zip file into a local repo folder. And you can see that. So all we need to do to get it into GreenRain is to just give it the name. There's no version with the downloaded zip. JavaScript often can find some very interesting frameworks. Sometimes there's not a lot of changes you need to make with JavaScript. It can be platform independent, but it's something I always recommend you include. For locate file, go into the repos and we open zip file. There is a limit of 400 meg, and then we click create, and GreenRain will now start processing the application. Now, how long this takes, it depends very much on the size and the complexity of the application, and also the resources you give GreenRain. So GreenRain is a very parallel application, and it will consume the CPUs and memory that you give it in the cloud. More resources, the faster it will process. So we'll come back to this when it's complete. Once your application has been imported, you can then go from the dashboard to drill into each application. In this case, we're going to look at Joomla Content Management System. First thing to know is this gives you a sense of the task ahead. So if we're going to migrate this to the cloud, if we want to modernize this application, it's a pretty big app. It uses quite a lot of frameworks, although it has just got one language in it, and that's PHP, which is a pretty friendly language to work with. Other important points to look at are complexity. So this is code complexity, for example, within modules, and it's like looping and iteration, and how readable is this code for a human being? If you're going to be changing code and it's very complex, then obviously that's going to increase probably the level of the developer that you need to fix that and their experience. Whereas if the complexity is low, it's highly likely that a more junior member of staff can make those changes. Entanglement. Imagine this as the integration and operation between classes and modules and often files in a code base. Entanglement shows that if you change one bit of code somewhere where it's highly entangled, you're likely to affect many other classes of modules, so care needs to be taken on how that's done. The next important piece is, first of all, we've said that from our analysis, we think there are technical dependencies that require action. And these come from the 3 settings we have here, which are defined by what we call our master dependency list. So in the master dependency list, we say, based on experience, and this is customizable for each GreenRain appliance, we've broken down technical dependencies into categories to make them easier to group and understand. But if we just quickly look at analytics, SixFusion, if we find something that we think is SixFusion, we're going to say it's part of the analytics category. And for cloud migration to Amazon, we've said this isn't critical. It's just an additional information, just something to be aware of, but something you can filter out. So if you go back to the dashboard and to the app, for example, we can say, hey, for this, we just want to look at critical. So we filter on those 2 fields, which reduces the amount of things we've got to look at. And you can see the typical features. These are really common. Disk I/O, writing to local disk. That sometimes needs to be changed if you're using ephemeral or immutable servers in the cloud. Hard-coded IPs. Sometimes these are discovered as just local host kind of IPs, 127.0.0.1, which aren't really a concern. But if someone's hard-coded an IP for an on-premises service, obviously that's not going to work if you move into the cloud, or it might need a specific type of networking. Two very common findings are database management systems and using things like HTTP session management. Both of these are very common optimizations and re-platforms when you move to the cloud. Now, before we go further, let's just a quick look at this very helpful but not complicated view. All we're saying here is, from the filter you've taken and the categories and findings we've got, based on the complexity levels that we understand, all we're saying is, for the company that's running this Greenrain appliance, they have these three types of developers that can make changes, or cloud engineers. They cost this much per hour. This is the speed they work at, and these, the complexities that we found, are the kinds of work that they could do. And it just helps you get an idea of what it might cost and what the remediation effort may be. Now, as we go down the page, we're going to drill a little bit deeper. We're just focusing on critical at the moment. And you can see the number of discoveries here. So we've got quite a wide range from Informix, Disk I/O, hard-coded IPs. I mean, hard-coded IPs, it has found 42 discoveries. So I think that is something that we can drill down to in the technical report, which is what we'll look at next. So far we've imported our application. We've selected the application in the dashboard, and we've drilled down to find out what are the summary information about this application, and talking about the critical categories that we found. One that particularly interests us is hard-coded IP, because there are at least 42 of those, and we know that there's likely to be some problem moving an application to the cloud if there's a hard-coded IP of something that's on premises, for example. And there are always opportunities for optimizations in maybe the cloud network. So that's always an interesting area to look at. We can quickly just drill down onto hard-coded IPs, and we can start to see these are the files that have hard-coded IP related dependencies in them. Now, some of these are tests, and they're going to be run locally, so they're the kind of thing that can be ignored. But it's good to make sure you see those and actively say they are not a concern. But how do we drill in deep? Because we can see the file, but we want to see the actual line of code in there, so we're going to view the technical report. Again, this is just for hard-coded IPs. Useful bubble chart to find outliers that are extremely complex or extremely entangled, but these look pretty straightforward. The first thing you do is you just click on the code snippet. The hover tells you something about it, but when you click on it, you can see the 2 lines of code in this PHP file. And as is quite normal, you sometimes get just the local host IP address in there. And in this line of code, it looks like it's connecting to a local host database. Now, if you continue to use the local host database in the cloud, then that could be fine. But you might at some point want to move to something like Amazon's RDS for MySQL, which in this case would not be good, because it wouldn't have the IP address and you would access it via a different connection string. So there's a good example of some finding that would be quite hard to find in 956,000 lines of code, to uncover something that either needs to be fixed because it will break, or optimized because you're going to be making changes somewhere else. So we've looked specifically at hard-coded IP as a category of dependencies that may break when moved to the cloud, and may offer optimization insights as well. There are more things you can find from the engine. It also looks at your application and whether it would be containerizable or not. And it does this by looking at the categories and saying, are there containers that would fit, or are there framework containers that you could use to run your application in the cloud? Now, this is a Joomla PHP content management system. And so if you were going to run this in the cloud, obviously some kind of PHP container would be helpful, because that's the language you need. But there are also other types of services that Greenrain has discovered that your application is using, you would need something like Docker Compose. There's different types of logging in there that you would look at. Other components we think would need to be looked at with regard of containerization. Now this is an important one, the OS level dependencies. If you're using session management, often this means you're saving state where your application is running. Now if your application is running in a container and containers are ephemeral, then the logic dictates that if that container dies, you lose your session information, which means users that are currently logged onto your Joomla CMS will lose their session, which is not good. And this is a classic finding from Greenrain in that when you're moving to the cloud, you're probably going to be using ephemeral or immutable or both containers and EC2 instances in the case of AWS. And then you probably want to look at your architecture to use distributed session management. So instead of storing state locally on your container, you can use something like Elasticache as a highly available separate session management system. So that's a really good finding to discover that this application uses. And Greenrain goes one little bit further to try and help you, and it does a search on Docker just to kind of cut a little corner for you to give you an insight that there are some Docker images related to some of the findings that we've had. So very useful if you're thinking of putting some or all of your application in containers. This gives you, again, from analyzing over 965,000 lines of code, we're giving you an insight to, these are the possibilities for containerization. So far, we've looked at how Greenrain can give you cloud-ready analysis and discover dependencies and categorize those into groups, which help you find things like database dependencies, session management dependencies, hard-coded IP dependencies, to help you work out if there are things you need to remediate because they're going to break, or optimize and modernize because you want to use cloud services instead of your homegrown database, for example. Then we looked at containers. If you want to container some or all of your application, these are the categories where you're going to need to containerize. And also, very useful insight into your application is what are the licensed products? Now, this can be a bit of a surprise and sometimes not a welcome surprise for enterprises when they find their application is using technology that requires licensing but isn't licensed. Oracle, for example, acquired MySQL some time ago. They also turned on licensing for Java. Now, Joomla CMS doesn't use Java, but if it did, it would turn up in this chart. And if we say, for example, we're concerned about our exposure to Oracle licensing, we can find that there are quite a few discoveries of each that we would need to go through and understand, are we licensed or not? So the first call here would be to our licensing team or procurement team and look at the agreements we've got with Oracle and make sure we're covered for this. But the most interesting aspect of this is to realize that if we do have these dependencies on Oracle, do we want to maintain that status quo when we move to the cloud? Is this an opportunity to move off Oracle onto something like AWS Aurora or something like PostgreSQL? This gives you an insight that not only can we migrate into the cloud, but we could modernize and maybe reduce our license exposure as part of that. And Greenrain's given you some signposts there to show you what you could do. So thank you for watching this short demo of Greenrain. You've seen how we've imported and analysed an application. Then we looked at three different things. First of all, we looked at how cloud ready is this application? What are the technical dependencies that may break a migration? And what are the opportunities for optimization in the cloud? Specifically, critical pieces like hard-coded IPs and opportunities to use cloud-managed databases and session management rather than the homegrown on-premises version. Then we also looked at how containerizable is my application. This is another very popular refactoring opportunity in the cloud to use containers rather than virtual machines. And what license dependencies exist in my application, and are there opportunities for me to make sure that I'm properly licensed or to move off those proprietary software into something like open source? Thank you very much.